My father chose his new family over me and lost everything once the truth came out. Can you imagine waking up one day to realize the people who should have protected you most were actually trying to erase you? Not subtly, not by accident, but with a cold, calculated efficiency that left me wondering, was I ever truly loved, or just a problem to be managed? This is my story, and it's messy, complicated, and a journey I never asked for. My earliest memories of home aren't of laughter or family dinners. They're basically just my mother on the couch, lost in her sickness, and me, this tiny kid, trying to help in ways that didn't actually change anything. I'd bring her water, straighten her blanket, pretending I was some kind of mini nurse. Meanwhile, my father moved through the house like a ghost, just wanting everything to be quiet. No one ever sat me down and said, "Hey, your mother is really sick. This is serious." It was more like, "This is normal. This is just how our house works. Stop asking so many questions." So I grew up thinking everyone had a bottle of medicine on the coffee table and a parent who sighed every time someone needed something. Back then, I didn't have the words for what was going on. I just knew my mother's good days were rare and my father's patience even rarer. On those good days, she'd sit up at the kitchen table, drink half a cup of coffee, and ask me about school. And I would talk nonstop because I never knew when the next good day would come. On the bad days, which were most of them, she barely spoke. And my father? He'd get this tight look on his face, like he was trapped. He did everything technically right, you know? Bills paid, groceries in the fridge, house in a quiet neighborhood. But emotionally, he was completely checked out. He called that keeping the peace. I called it pretending not to see what was right in front of him. I figured out pretty early that if something needed doing for my mother, I was going to be the one doing it. Getting her a glass of water, helping her to the bathroom, bringing her pills that I didn't fully understand. I'd stand on my toes to reach the cabinet because my father was always just out of reach himself, always in the garage or outside, or somewhere else that wasn't next to his sick wife. If she cried, I'd panic and ask if I should call him, and she'd shake her head and say she was fine, that I was enough. I loved hearing that I was enough, and I hated that it was true all at the same time. By the time I was 10, I knew the layout of my mother's hospital better than any mall. I knew which nurses liked me and which ones pretended not to see me when I hovered near the doorway. My father hated those visits. He'd stand by the bed like he was visiting a coworker, talk about practical things, and then leave early, saying something about needing to get up for work. I stayed as long as they let me, because even when my mother was half asleep and barely coherent, she still held my hand like she never wanted to let go. Those were the moments that made sense to me. Everything else felt like a performance. When she died, I was 12, and I remember every single detail of that day in a way that feels ridiculous, like my brain decided to hit record and never hit stop. The call, the ride to the hospital, the smell of disinfectant, and the way my father's shoulders dropped in this almost relieved way when the doctor said there was nothing more they could do. I didn't scream or collapse or do anything dramatic. I just stared at the wall and tried to understand how the world could keep going when the one person who actually saw me was gone. My father put a hand on my shoulder and said he knew this was hard, but at least she was at peace now. He didn't cry. He didn't say he missed her. He just recited that line like he'd been practicing it. The days after the funeral were a blur of casseroles, people talking in hushed voices, and my father moving through the house like a man who was already halfway onto his next chapter. He threw himself into work, into errands, into anything that kept him from sitting still. Anytime someone tried to talk about my mother, he'd say something like, she wouldn't want us to dwell on the past, and then change the subject. I stopped bringing her up because it was clear that my grief made him uncomfortable. So I grieved alone, in my room, with a few things of hers that were still out in the open. That was when it really hit me. I wasn't a priority for him. I was just another responsibility he had to manage. The anger settled in slowly like dust. It wasn't one big fight or one horrible moment. It was 100 tiny things that added up. How he would roll his eyes if I mentioned a memory of my mother. How he would talk about the future, like my mother had never been part of it. How he started going out more, staying later at work, leaving me to eat dinner alone. I wanted him to sit down and talk to me about how much we both missed her, but that conversation never came. Instead, we slipped into this weird, cold distance where we were technically family, but felt more like roommates waiting for the lease to end. I wish I could say that either of us tried to fix it, but we didn't. I was 12 and drowning, and he was a grown man who refused to get his feet wet. Every time I thought about bringing up how I felt, I heard his voice in my head calling me dramatic, and I swallowed the words. He told himself he was keeping things calm by not talking about anything painful. I learned that in our house, peace always meant silence, and silence always meant pretending there was nothing to be upset about. 3 months after my mother died, my father came home one evening with that weird, nervous energy he got when he was about to do something he knew I wouldn't like. He knocked on my bedroom door, which was already unusual, and asked me to come to the living room because there was someone he wanted me to meet. My stomach dropped. I was still in sweats, hair in a messy bun, surrounded by my homework and a little shrine I'd basically built to my mother on my desk. I remember wiping my face, even though I hadn't. Been crying and telling myself not to freak out before I even knew what was happening. When I walked into the living room, there she was. A woman sitting on her couch like she belonged there, legs crossed, hands folded on her lap, smiling at me like this was a normal introduction and not my father detonating a bomb in the middle of our house. She looked utterly put together in that way that takes effort. Hair done, clothes coordinated, makeup subtle but very much present. My father's voice went too bright as he said my name and then introduced her as someone he had been seeing. I stood there and nodded because what else was I supposed to do? Start screaming in front of a stranger? She told me she was so sorry about my mother, that she knew this must be hard, and that she was not trying to replace anyone. People love that line, by the way. They say it like the fact that they know they're stepping into a dead woman's house somehow makes it better. I muttered something polite and kept my arms wrapped around myself. My father watched me closely, like he was waiting for me to act out, so he could prove to her that I was the problem. When I didn't, he relaxed, which, honestly, made me want to act out even more. The visits started happening more often after that. She came over for dinner, for weekends, for random afternoons. She started learning where things were in the kitchen, where the plates went, which drawer had the silverware. Little things shifted, small enough that I felt crazy for noticing them. A picture frame moved. A throw pillow replaced. A mug that had been my mother's quietly disappeared from the dish rack. Every time I mentioned any of it, my father would shrug and say I was reading into things. He said I was too sensitive, that I was making things harder than they needed to be. 2 months later, she moved in. No long family discussion, no serious talk. I came home from school one day, and her boxes were stacked in the hallway, labeled with her handwriting. My father announced it at dinner like he was telling me we were trying a new brand of cereal. He said it made sense since there was no point in keeping 2 places when they were spending so much time together. Anyway, I stared at my plate, my mind buzzing, and asked what was happening with my mother's things. He said, "We'll figure it out." By we, he meant her. Watching her walk into my mother's bedroom with empty boxes under her arm felt like being erased in slow motion. She started taking my mother's clothes out of the closet, folding them mechanically, like she was packing up a stranger's life. I stood in the doorway for as long as I could, until my chest hurt. When I finally asked if we could maybe leave some things where they were a little longer, she gave me this patient smile and said it would be good for me to move on. My father backed her up. He said keeping everything the same would just keep us stuck in the past. That night, after they went to bed, I went down to the basement and opened the boxes where they had shoved my mother's entire existence. I dug through them and pulled out whatever I could carry. A scarf that still smelled like her perfume. A worn sweater. A small picture frame with a photo of the 2 of us at a fair. Her favorite book with notes in the margins. I stuffed them into my backpack like I was stealing from my own family. It felt wrong and right at the same time. I hid those things in my room, in the back of my closet like contraband. When I tried to talk to my father about how much it hurt to see my mother's things boxed up, he shut me down so fast it made my head spin. He said I was being dramatic, that life had to go on, that other people moved on much faster after losses like ours. He talked about how his new partner had been a great support to him, how she made the house feel alive again. The way he said alive made me want to throw something. I told him it felt like she was replacing my mother. He told me I needed to be more mature, that adults had different needs, and I didn't understand. From that point on, I was basically a guest in my own house. Every time I walked into a room, I was reminded that nothing belonged to my mother anymore, and by extension, barely anything belonged to me. A family friend tried to step in once. She pulled my father aside at a gathering and told him maybe he was moving too fast, that maybe he needed to slow down for my sake. He told her, with that same fake calm voice, that he wouldn't let anyone tell him how to grieve. Which was hilarious, honestly, because grief was the last thing he was interested in. She didn't push after that. And it was one of the first times I realized most people aren't going to fight for you if the person who should be fighting already checked out. Within a year of my mother's death, my father and his new partner announced they were getting married. They did it casually in the kitchen over takeout. He said they had been talking and decided it was time to make things official. I remember the fork in my hand shaking. I asked if anyone had talked to my grandparents about it. He said yes, and that they hadn't been very supportive, but that this was his life and his decision. That was the moment I knew things were about to get even uglier. My father's sister called me not long after to check in, which was not something she did often before. She asked how I was really doing, and if my father had mentioned the wedding. When I told her, she sighed and said she had tried to talk him out of it, that it was too soon, that he wasn't thinking clearly. A part of me wished she had pushed harder. Another part of me knew that he wouldn't have listened to anyone. My paternal grandparents refused to attend the wedding. They had loved my mother in a way that made sense to me, and to them, my father's new relationship was a slap in the face to her memory. The wedding ended up being a small, awkward ceremony that felt more like a rehearsal than the real thing. A couple of coworkers, a neighbor, one cousin who apparently didn't get the memo or didn't care. I stood there in a dress my new stepmother picked out for me, watching my father smile like nothing about this was messed up. My grandparents didn't show up. My aunt didn't show up. There was no big family celebration, just a sad little gathering where everyone pretended this was normal. I didn't cry. I felt numb in a way that scared me more than tears ever could. At school, I pulled back from everything. I stopped bringing friends over because I didn't want to answer questions about the new woman in the house or why my grandparents weren't in any of our recent photos. I skipped events that required parents because I couldn't stand the thought of standing next to my father and my stepmother while teachers called us a family. I was there physically, but I checked out mentally. It was easier to focus on homework and pretend that if I just did well enough, one day I would get out of that house and never look back. The years after the wedding blurred together until one day there was news big enough to cut through the numbness. About a year after they got married, my stepmother announced she was pregnant. And not just pregnant, expecting twins. My father lit up in a way I hadn't seen in years, maybe ever. He talked about baby names, nursery colors, schedules. All the things he had never talked about with my mother in front of me. It was like watching him get a second shot at the family he really wanted. And I was very clearly not part of that picture. As her belly grew, so did her control over the house. She started making small updates to my room without asking. First, it was new curtains that didn't match anything I owned. Then, a different comforter. Then, she started moving my furniture around, talking about how my room could be more efficient, how I should make space. When I came home one day and found one of my mother's old items that I had kept on my dresser missing, I lost it. I went straight to her and demanded to know where it was. She shrugged and said it was old and dusty, that she had put it in a box in the basement with other things that didn't fit the new vibe of the house. That word, vibe, made my skin crawl. I told my father what happened, and instead of backing me up, he told me I needed to be more flexible. He said his wife was pregnant and stressed, that she was allowed to nest, that I should stop looking for reasons to be upset. He made it sound like I was inconveniencing a guest instead of being his actual kid in my own home. I started spending more time in my room with the door closed, headphones in, pretending I couldn't hear their conversations. The more her pregnancy advanced, the more chaotic the house became. My stepmother's moods were unpredictable. One minute, she was overly sweet, asking me politely to grab something from the kitchen. The next minute, she was snapping at me for breathing too loudly. My father's solution was always the same: stay late at work. He left early, came home late, and ignored the tension simmering under his roof. If I tried to tell him about the way she talked to me when he wasn't around, he would say I was exaggerating. That word stuck to my skin like glue. Eventually, things got bad enough that I did something I had never done before. I asked for help outside the family. At school, There was a counselor who always seemed actually present when she talked to students, not just going through the motions. One afternoon, after a particularly nasty morning where my stepmother had accused me of purposely slamming cabinets to stress her out, I went to the counselor's office and asked if she had a minute. I ended up staying for almost an hour, telling her everything about my mother, my father, the new wife, the boxes in the basement, the way I felt like I was being slowly pushed out of my own life. She listened without interrupting, and when I finally ran out of words, she said something that stuck with me. She said, "What you are living is not normal, and it is not your fault." It sounds simple, but it hit me hard because nobody in my house had ever put it that clearly. She didn't try to fix it in one session, didn't tell me to confront anyone or run away. She just validated that what I felt made sense. For the first time in a long time, I felt less crazy. After that, I started paying more attention to the pattern. I realized my stepmother wasn't just moody or stressed. She was intentionally making the house uncomfortable for me. Changing my room, criticizing everything I did, acting like I was invading her space when I walked through the kitchen. I'm not stupid. It didn't take long to figure out that she wanted me gone. Not in the dramatic movie way, just in the slow, calculated way where one day I would pack a bag and leave on my own, so she could say it had been my choice. So I made a decision. I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. If she wanted me out, she was going to have to say it out loud. I told myself I would stay until she, or my father, explicitly told me to leave. It was petty and stubborn. But honestly, at that point, petty and stubborn were the only things I had left that belonged to me. The breaking point came over dinner, which feels fitting because so many of our worst moments happened at that table. The twins were a few months old by then, full of noise and demands. My stepmother was bouncing one baby on her lap while the other fussed in a high chair. My father was trying to eat quickly between grabbing bottles and napkins. I was quietly cutting my food, trying to make myself invisible. Out of nowhere, my stepmother put down her fork, looked straight at me and said, "This cannot keep going like this." My fork froze halfway to my mouth. She went on, explaining that the house felt tense whenever I was around, that the babies were picking up on the stress, that she couldn't relax in her own home because she never knew what mood I would be in. She said my energy was toxic. Yes, she actually used that word. Then she said she thought it would be best if I went to live with my grandparents for a while. She made it sound like a generous offer instead of what it really was. An eviction notice with a fake smile. I turned to my father, waiting for him to shut it down, to say, "Absolutely not. This is my daughter and this is her home." Instead, he cleared his throat and said he had been thinking the same thing. He tried to soften it with phrases like, maybe a fresh start would be good for everyone. And it's not that we don't want you here, but the message was clear. He wanted a do-over. A new family without the complication of a teenage daughter who remembered too much. I pointed out that the house was big enough for all of us, that I wasn't asking for much, just space that actually felt like mine and basic respect. He didn't respond. He stared at his plate. My stepmother smirked just slightly. In that moment, something inside me cracked. I realized I had been holding on to this tiny fantasy that he would wake up and fight for me. And he was not going to. Not now, not ever. The next morning, I called my grandfather from the school parking lot. I told him everything, including the part where my father had sat there and let his wife tell me to leave. My grandfather went quiet for a long second, and I could hear him breathing. Then he said in that low, controlled voice he saved for serious things, that I shouldn't do anything rash just yet, but that he had heard enough to know this wasn't a safe place for me anymore. He asked me to give him a little time to figure out the logistics. I agreed. Inside, though, I had already made my own decision. If they pushed me out, I was gone for good. No turning back. No, maybe someday we'll fix this. A week later, my stepmother knocked on my bedroom door like we were roommates and told me she had talked to my grandparents. She said they were happy to have me, and that we should start packing my things. She sounded almost pleased with herself, like she had just closed a difficult work deal. What she didn't know was that my grandfather had already called me the night before. He also told me later that he had already been talking to a lawyer for weeks before that, getting everything ready in case things blew up, because he could see where this was heading. He told me exactly what he had said to my father on the phone. According to him, he hadn't sugar-coated anything. He had told my father that by choosing his new wife's comfort over his own daughter's place in the home, he was throwing me away. He had said that once I left, he shouldn't expect to call and ask for forgiveness later because he was making his choice in full awareness of what it meant. Apparently, my father cried during that call. My grandfather told me that not like it was a sign of hope, but like it was a sad little detail that didn't change anything. You can cry all you want while you're pushing someone out the door. The tears don't magically open the door back up. The next day, my grandparents came to pick me up. My grandmother hugged me for so long I thought I might actually collapse just from the shock of being held like that. My grandfather walked into the house with this calm, cold determination that made even my stepmother step back for a second. My father had already signed the paperwork, giving my grandparents temporary guardianship, which felt like he had signed over ownership of a piece of furniture, not his kid. Before we loaded the car, I went to my room one last time. I opened the closet and pulled out the things of my mother's that I had hidden over the years, packing them carefully into my suitcase. When I turned around, my father was standing in the doorway. For a second, I thought maybe this was it. This was the part where he would fight for me, or at least apologize. Instead, he looked at the items in my hands and said, "You don't need to take all that old stuff. It's just clutter." I stared at him, stunned. Those were the last pieces of my mother I had, and he called them clutter. I told him flatly that they were mine, that they were coming with me. He rolled his eyes and stepped aside. No hug. No, I love you. No, I'm sorry. Just a man moving out of the way so we could finish packing. On my way down the hall, my stepmother grabbed my arm. Her nails dug into my skin as she leaned close and said, "Enjoy being the favorite granddaughter while it lasts. You don't deserve it, and one day they'll see that." Her breath was hot, and it took everything in me not to yank my arm back and start a screaming match. Instead, I looked at her and said, "The difference between them and you is that they have already seen who I am and decided I am worth loving." Then I walked away. My voice shook, but I meant every word. I got into my grandparents' car without looking back at the house. I knew that if I did, I might hesitate, and I was done hesitating. On the drive to their place, my phone buzzed with calls and messages from my father's number. I watched the screen light up over and over and refused to answer. By the time we pulled into my grandparents' driveway, I had already decided that if he wanted to talk to me, he was going to have to put in a lot more effort than a few panicked calls on move-out day. Life with my grandparents was like stepping into a different world, one where the air felt lighter and people actually meant what they said. They hugged me every day for no particular reason. They asked how I was sleeping, what I wanted for dinner, how school was going, and they actually listened to the answers. They put my name on the mailbox and told the neighbors I was their granddaughter who had come to live with them. Not a guest, not a temporary project. I unpacked my suitcase and put my mother's things on a shelf in my new room without anyone telling me. They ruined the vibe. They handled all the practical stuff, like it was no big deal. They took me to enroll at a school closer to their house, filed the necessary forms, and put me on their health insurance. My father didn't fight any of it. For a week, he called every day. I let the phone ring. My grandmother would look at the caller ID, look at me and say, "You don't owe him anything right now." After about 7 days, the calls stopped. That told me everything I needed to know about how hard he was really willing to try. A year later, when my grandparents added me to their phone plan, I blocked his number. It felt dramatic and final, and for once, I didn't care if anyone thought I was overreacting. Someone in the extended family tried to deliver a letter from him a while after that. I recognized his handwriting on the envelope and handed it back without opening it. If he wanted to talk, he could go through my grandparents and ask for permission like everyone else had to when it came to me. Funny how he never did. Time moved on. I finished high school, applied to community college, and stayed in the same city on purpose because leaving my grandparents was the one thing I knew I didn't want to do. I worked part-time at a coffee shop and later at a front desk in a small clinic, paying my share of the bills, even though my grandparents told me I didn't have to. It made me feel less like I was taking advantage of them, and more like I was contributing to the home that had actually felt like home from day one. By the time I turned 25, I thought my father drama was mostly behind me. We had fallen into this unspoken arrangement where he existed in some parallel version of our family tree that I didn't have to interact with. I knew he was still married. I heard things here and there about the twins through relatives who didn't know how to filter their updates. I tried not to think about it too much. Then, my grandparents called me into the living room one evening and said we needed to talk about something serious. My grandfather started with a question that immediately made my stomach clench. He asked what I knew about my father's finances. Not much, obviously. I said I assumed he was fine because he had always acted like he was doing more than fine. My grandfather nodded slowly and then told me that my aunt, my father's sister, had dug into some things after a weird conversation she had with him. She had found out that my stepmother had been controlling their money from the start. Not in the normal way couples manage bills together, but in the shady way where accounts get opened in one person's name without their full consent. There were loans my father didn't seem fully aware of. Credit cards he had supposedly forgotten they applied for. Investments he couldn't explain when asked. My aunt connected enough dots to realize that my stepmother had been maneuvering herself into the position of financial gatekeeper from day one. My father was technically an adult signing the papers, so he was still responsible, but the pattern was clear. She had slowly cut him off from having real control over his own money. Hearing all of that did this weird thing inside me. On one hand, it explained a lot. It explained why he never fought harder for anything, why he always acted like he couldn't afford consequences, why he let her make big choices about the house without pushing back. On the other hand, it didn't fix anything for me. Knowing he was also being manipulated didn't erase the fact that he had stood by and watched me be pushed out. You can be a victim and still be the person who hurt someone else. Both can be true. My grandfather went on to tell me that after learning all this, he had decided to update his will. He said it as casually as he could, but his hand shook slightly when he passed me a copy of the document. He and my grandmother had decided that my father would no longer be included as a beneficiary. Neither would the twins. The estate, which was not some billionaire-level thing, but still more than most people had, would go to me and to my aunt. My name was on there as the only grandchild. When I looked up, my grandfather's eyes were wet. He told me he wanted to make sure that if anything happened to them, I would be okay. Not just alive and scraping by, okay, but actually okay. I didn't know what to say. I had never been in the position of being prioritized like that, at least not by an adult with any real power. I thanked them, obviously, but it still felt surreal. My grandmother reached over, squeezed my knee, and said, "We're just putting on paper what has been true in our hearts for a long time." Cheesy, but in that moment, it was exactly what I needed. Making the will official had ripple effects, of course. My aunt believed my father's wife would find out eventually, and she was right. It didn't take long. A few weeks later, I opened my email and saw a message from a name I never expected to see in my inbox, my stepmother. The subject line was my name, my full name, which already felt like a bad sign. The email was long, bitter, and absolutely full of projection. She accused me of manipulating my grandparents, of turning them against their own son, of scheming to get their money. She said I had always been a selfish child, that I had poisoned their minds with stories about her, that I had no gratitude for everything she and my father had done for me. She hinted at legal steps she would take to correct what she called this injustice. Seeing those words on the screen made my chest tighten, not because I believed her, but because the tone was so familiar. It was the same voice she had used in our house when she accused me of creating tension. I showed the email to my grandparents. My grandmother's face turned red and my grandfather's jaw clenched. He told me this was exactly why he had made his decision about the will. He said it had nothing to do with me begging or plotting, and everything to do with him seeing clearly who had been there for him and who had not. He also told me not to respond to her. He said, "She wants a fight. Don't give her one." I listened. I archived the email and blocked her address. For a few days, I felt shaky, like she might appear at the door at any moment. Turned out I wasn't entirely wrong about that feeling. Not long after, there was a knock at my grandparents' front door in the middle of a Saturday afternoon. My grandmother looked through the window and her eyes went wide. She whispered, "They're here." I didn't even have to ask who. I could hear my stepmother's voice before the door fully opened, loud and insistent, with my father's lower, more apologetic tone underneath it, and the chaotic noise of kids who clearly hadn't been taught what an indoor voice was. They walked into the house like they owned the place. My stepmother marched ahead, the twins trailing behind her, touching everything. My father hovered near the entrance, awkward and tense, like he already knew this was a bad idea, but was too far in to back out. I stayed in the doorway between the hall and the living room, half hidden, because I wanted to see how they would act when they thought I wasn't fully in the conversation yet. My stepmother got straight to the point. She accused my grandparents of letting me turn them against their own son. She pointed at me and said I was manipulating them with my sad little stories. She complained about the will being changed, about how unfair it was that the twins were being punished for something they had nothing to do with. My grandfather let her talk for a while then. He raised his hand, and to my shock, she actually went quiet. He spoke slowly, but every word landed. He told her that nobody had turned him against his son. He had simply watched what happened, weighed everyone's actions over the years, and made his own choice. He said that if my father had wanted to be the kind of man who stayed in the will, he could have made different choices a long time ago. He told her that her behavior that day, storming in and making demands, was exactly why she was not going to be rewarded with anything of his. Then he turned to my father. This part hurt more than anything my stepmother said. My grandfather looked at his own son and told him he was ashamed, not just of that day, but of the pattern of watching him let a child be pushed out of her home, of seeing him choose avoidance over responsibility again and again. He said he had never expected his son to be perfect, but he had expected him to at least show up for his kid. Hearing that, seeing my father's face crumple, almost made me feel sorry for him. Almost. The twins, bored and restless, knocked over a picture frame during all this and started whining about being hungry. My stepmother snapped at them to be quiet. My father made some faint attempt at corralling them before giving up. The whole scene was a disaster. Eventually, my grandfather asked them to leave, not politely. He told them they were not welcome in his house if they could not respect his decisions. My stepmother sputtered and threatened again to get lawyers involved. My grandfather shrugged and said she could do whatever she wanted. It would not change the fact that his money was his to give, and he had already given his answer. After they left, the house felt weirdly still. My grandmother sat down heavily on the couch, like someone had taken all the air out of her. My grandfather went outside for a while. I stood in the middle of the living room and realized my hands were shaking. For years, I had been the one standing alone in someone else's house while adults decided my fate. This time I was in the house where the adults were on my side. That shift was bigger than any inheritance document. I wish I could say that was the last time my father tried to rewrite history, but of course it wasn't. A few weeks later, I got another email, this time from a different address. It was my father. The subject line was, "Can we talk?" The body of the email was long and carefully crafted. He didn't apologize outright. Instead, he described himself as a man caught between two women, trying his best, always wanting peace. He accused me of telling a one-sided story. He said I had turned his parents against him by refusing to move on. There was even a part where he dragged my mother into it, which was honestly what pushed me from hurt into anger again. He wrote that my mother would be disappointed in me for holding grudges and tearing the family apart. Reading those words, I felt like I was 12 again, being told I was too dramatic for crying over my mother's clothes disappearing. I read the email twice just to make sure I wasn't imagining the manipulation. I showed it to my grandparents, and my grandfather shook his head with that same tired sadness I had seen in his eyes after the confrontation. That was the moment I decided I was done letting him define the narrative. I sat down at my laptop and drafted a reply. I kept it short on purpose because the temptation to go point by point and relitigate every moment of my childhood was strong, and I knew that would just pull me back into his orbit. I told him that I remembered very clearly who was there for me and who was not. I said I did not accept his version of events, that I did not owe him reconciliation, and that I was not interested in being in contact anymore. I told him not to email me again. No insults, no dramatic sign-off, just firm boundaries. After I hit send, I blocked his new email address too. My grandparents didn't celebrate or act like I had done something brave. They just nodded and asked if I wanted to watch a show with them. That normality was exactly what I needed. For the first time, I felt like I had closed a door on purpose instead of having it slammed in my face. Of course, he didn't give up right away. He tried going around me instead. He showed up at my grandparents' house a few days later, alone this time. I wasn't there when it happened, but my grandfather told me about it afterward. My father asked if they would reconsider the will, said he was going through a lot, mentioned that the twins were getting older and had expenses. My grandfather listened, then repeated what he had already said. His money was not a reward for good behavior, but he also was not going to give it to someone who had walked away from their responsibilities. My father left with nothing. Financially, anyway. Emotionally, I have no idea what he left with. Maybe some regret. Maybe just frustration that the tactic of guilt tripping had stopped working on his parents the way it had stopped working on me. Life moved forward again, like it always does. I focused on work, on finishing my degree, on figuring out what I wanted beyond just not being like my father. I moved into a small apartment not far from my grandparents' house. The kind of place where you can hear your neighbors coughing through the wall, but the rent doesn't require selling a kidney. I decorated it slowly, mostly with thrift store finds and a handful of things of my mother's that I still had. Every time I hung something on the wall, I asked myself if I was doing it because I liked it or because I thought it was what a normal home should look like. I was trying to build something that felt like mine, not just a reaction to everything I had lived through. Then came the call about the accident. My grandmother answered the phone, and I could tell from her face that it was something big. She handed me the receiver and mouthed my father's name. My first instinct was to say wrong number and hang up. Instead, I listened. A neighbor of my father's was on the line. She explained that there had been some kind of incident in their garage. My father had been working with tools while his wife backed the car out. She had not checked behind her properly. He ended up with his leg pinned between the car and a workbench. Multiple fractures, emergency surgery, long recovery. I didn't rush to the hospital. I didn't go at all. My grandparents did. They told me later that seeing him in a hospital bed brought back too many memories of my mother for them. He was groggy, in pain, and apparently more honest than usual. He admitted that he no longer trusted his wife, that the accident had felt like a physical manifestation of the fact that he had been standing in the wrong place for years. He said he was scared of what would happen to him if he kept pretending everything was fine. When my grandparents came home and told me all that, I felt weirdly numb. I didn't want him hurt. I'm not a monster. But I also didn't feel some sudden rush of compassion that erased everything. It just felt like a consequence, finally catching up with him. Not in the dramatic karma way people love to post about on feel-good pages, but in the simple, predictable way relationships fall apart when they're built on denial and avoidance. The accident left him with serious mobility issues and a pile of medical bills. His wife, who had spent years positioning herself as the one in control, suddenly seemed less committed now that in sickness and in health was being tested for real. From what my aunt told us, the tension in their house went from high to unbearable. Arguments, blame, long stretches of silence. My father, who had always avoided confrontation, suddenly had nowhere to hide. He couldn't escape to work or take long walks. He was stuck in a house with a woman who had helped isolate him and now resented the weight of caring for him. Eventually, he filed for divorce, not from a position of strength, but from sheer exhaustion. He didn't fight for a lot in the settlement. He kept the house because it had been his before the marriage, but she walked away with a lot more money and assets than someone looking in from the outside would think was fair, especially given how much of the debt trail led back to her. He told my grandparents he just wanted it over, that he didn't have the energy for a drawn-out battle. That was the story of his life in one sentence. He didn't have the energy to fight, even when it mattered most. He ended up with shared custody of the twins, which meant he still had to deal with his ex more than he wanted to. He was in pain, both physically and financially, and he had finally been forced to see who his wife really was. Part of me thought, okay, this is where he realizes what he did to me, where he calls and says, "I get it now." That call never came. He talked to my grandparents about how trapped he had felt, how embarrassed he was. He never once said, "I'm sorry for how I treated her." Meaning me. The last update I got about him came through my aunt. She called one evening and said she thought I should know that he had tried one more time to get my grandparents to change their will. He showed up at their house again, limping without his ex, looking older and smaller than she had ever seen him. He talked about his medical bills, about the twins, about how hard things had been since the divorce. My grandfather listened and then told him, very gently this time, that some consequences didn't disappear just because life had gotten harder. My aunt asked me if I wanted to see him. She said he looked like a man who might finally understand what he had lost. I thought about it. I imagined walking into a room with him, having him look up and say my name in that sad, broken voice he had used when he talked to my grandparents. I imagined him apologizing. I also imagined him slipping back into old habits the second he felt a little more comfortable, twisting words, making himself the victim. In the end, I told her no. I didn't want my closure to depend on a conversation he might or might not be capable of having. I need to pause the timeline for a second here, because it wasn't just drama with my father happening on a loop all those years. There was also the life I was building underneath all of that, and it matters. In between all those updates about my father and his choices, there was the part of my life that actually felt like it was mine. And I don't want to skip over that because it matters. I am not just the sum of what they did to me. After I moved in with my grandparents, and the dust settled a little, I had to figure out how to be a regular teenager in a house that was finally safe, but still full of history. It was weird, honestly. I was used to constantly checking other people's moods, tiptoeing around conflict, watching every word. My grandparents weren't saints, but they were stable in a way I had never experienced. If they were annoyed, they said so and moved on. Nobody held grudges for weeks. Nobody used silent treatment as a weapon. The first holiday season with them was the one that really threw me. My grandmother baked enough food to feed 3 extra families, decorated the house with lights that made the whole street look warm, and insisted I invite at least 2 friends over at some point so she could meet the kids who put up with me all day. I laughed it off, but when my friends came and saw the spread, their eyes got huge. One of them joked that she was going to move in, too. I joked back, but inside, I felt this mix of gratitude and panic, like if I enjoyed it too much, it would disappear. My grandmother noticed me hovering near the kitchen doorway, not quite joining in, and she pulled me into a hug right there in front of everyone. She said, "You are allowed to belong here." I pretended to roll my eyes, because being sentimental in front of friends is illegal at that age. But I replayed that line in my head for weeks. School got a little easier once my brain was not permanently stuck in fight or flight. I still had anxiety. Obviously, you don't just flip a switch and become a carefree person after all that. But I could focus a little better. I started actually hearing what teachers were saying instead of spending entire classes planning escape routes in my head. I joined a couple of low-pressure clubs. Nothing wild, just things that gave me an excuse to stay after school and feel like a normal kid. My grandparents showed up for parent nights without complaining, sat in those tiny chairs, listened to teachers talk about my grades, and then took me out for ice cream from a neighborhood place afterward, like it was the most natural thing in the world. At some point, my grandmother suggested therapy. She did it gently, not like, "You are broken, go get fixed," but more like, "You have been carrying a lot for a long time. Maybe it would help to set some of it down with someone who knows how to hold it." I resisted at first because I had spent years telling myself my situation was not bad enough to deserve that kind of help. There are people with horror stories that sound way worse on paper, right? Who was I to take up space in a therapist's office with my dramatic little family saga? Yes, that is how deep my father's favorite word got into my brain. Eventually I gave in and went. The therapist's office was small and warm, with plants that were very much alive, which honestly felt like a good sign. I sat on the edge of the couch at the first session and told her I didn't really know where to start. She smiled like she heard that line from every new client and told me to pick one memory that still felt loud in my head. I picked the dinner where my stepmother told me I should leave. By the time I finished talking, I was shaking and angry and embarrassed because part of me still wondered if I had overreacted. She didn't say, "That is the worst thing I have ever heard," or, "Wow, your parents are monsters." She said, "No child should be asked to leave their home so the adults can feel more comfortable." It was simple and direct, and it cut through a lot of noise. Therapy didn't magically fix anything, but it gave me language for things I had been trying to explain to myself for years. Words like parentification for how I had been turned into a mini caregiver for my mother. Words like enmeshment and avoidance and gaslighting, which I had joked about before without really understanding how deeply they applied. It also gave me permission to feel more than one thing at once. I could be angry at my father and still remember that he used to make pancakes on Saturday mornings. I could miss my mother and still feel relieved that she was not stuck in that marriage anymore. It didn't have to be either, /or. By the time I was finishing community college, my life looked from the outside pretty ordinary. I worked at the clinic during the day, went to classes in the evening, and crashed on my grandparents' couch more often than I probably should have, given that I technically had my own room like an actual adult. I had a couple of close friends who knew the rough outline of my history, and one who knew pretty much everything. We would sit in my car in the parking lot after late classes, talking about our families with that mix of exhaustion and humor you only hear from people who are trying to heal while still living on a budget. Romantic relationships were a whole separate challenge. Surprise, surprise. It turns out that growing up with adults who either ignored conflict or weaponized it doesn't exactly prepare you for healthy dating. I picked a few people who were emotionally unavailable in new and creative ways because that felt familiar. If someone was steady and kind, I found reasons to be suspicious. If someone was inconsistent, my nervous system lit up like a holiday display. At least I recognized the pattern eventually, which is more than I can say for my father. Every time I told my therapist about some new, romantic disaster, she would give me that look and ask what part of the dynamic felt familiar. She was almost always right. There was one relationship in particular that forced me to really look at my patterns. He was sweet, patient, funny in a quiet way. He listened when I talked and remembered details I didn't even remember telling him. Whenever we disagreed, he didn't shut down or blow up. He actually wanted to work through it. It stressed me out so much that I almost walked away 3 separate times. At one point he said, "You act like I'm about to kick you out if you annoy me for 5 minutes." I laughed it off in the moment, but later alone, I had to admit he had hit on something I had never said out loud. Deep down, I still believed love was conditional and temporary, something that could be revoked if I took up too much space. We didn't end up together forever, by the way, in case you were hoping for that kind of bow on this part of the story. Life pulled us in different directions, and we broke up in a way that was bittersweet, but not dramatic. Still, that relationship mattered because it gave me proof that conflict did not have to mean someone was about to throw my stuff in a box and tell me to leave. That sounds simple when you say it, but when you grew up living the opposite, it's like learning gravity works differently than you thought. Meanwhile, my grandparents were getting older. That was its own kind of grief, creeping up on me. I started noticing little things, like my grandfather needing more time to get up from the couch, or my grandmother forgetting where she put her keys more often. Nothing catastrophic, just the slow, steady march of time. We started having conversations about the future that made all of us uncomfortable. They insisted that I look at the will not as a countdown, but as a safety net. I insisted that they stop driving at night. We compromised somewhere in the middle, like functional people do. When I finally moved into my own place, they were more emotional about it than I was. My grandmother cried in my tiny kitchen while helping me unpack dishes, talking about how proud my mother would have been to see me standing on my own feet. My grandfather pretended not to be emotional, but he checked every window lock twice and asked about the fire escape like he was conducting a building inspection. I rolled my eyes and made jokes, but the truth is, having someone worry about whether I had working smoke detectors felt like a luxury. It was around that time that my father tried a new route to reach me that didn't go through phones or emails. Someone sent me a friend request on a social media app under a name I didn't recognize, but the profile had a picture of his house, which was subtle in the way a brick through a window is subtle. I stared at the screen for a long time, my thumb hovering over the accept button. Part of me was curious. What would he send if I let that door crack open? Pictures of the twins? Long messages about how misunderstood he was? Another version of the story where I was the villain? In the end, I hit decline and blocked the account. If he wanted to talk, he could do it like an adult, not through fake profiles and backdoor channels. I know some people listening to this are probably thinking, but what if he really has changed now? I ask myself that sometimes too. Usually late at night when my brain decides to run the greatest hits of every hard conversation I have ever had. Maybe he has changed. Pain can do that. Losing his marriage, his health, and his financial safety net could have cracked something open in him. I don't root against that. I would genuinely rather he become a better person for his own sake and for the sake of the twins. I just don't believe that his potential growth obligates me to walk back into a dynamic that almost erased me. There is this pressure, especially in families, to make pain worth something by turning it into reconciliation. People love a redemption arc. They want the daughter at the hospital bedside holding the father's hand while he apologizes and everyone cries and then they all go out for lunch afterward. That is a nice story. It just isn't mine. My version looks more like getting a text from my aunt about his latest medical update, sending a polite, "Thanks for letting me know," and then going back to my life. It looks like dropping off groceries at my grandparents', helping my grandmother with her tablet, and then going home to my small apartment that doesn't smell like denial and resentment. I'm not saying I will never rethink any of this. I'm not psychic. I don't know who I will be in 10 years or how I will feel about any of this when my grandparents are gone and the family tree feels even emptier. What I do know is that right now, the boundaries I have put in place are what keep me functioning. They are the reason I can go to work without spiraling every time an older man raises his voice. They are the reason I can walk into my own kitchen and know that nobody is about to tell me I take up too much space in it. So here I am, telling you all of this like a long, messy voice note that got away from me. My name is Taran, in case you were wondering, and I am not the tragic girl who got thrown out and never recovered. I am also not some saint who forgave everyone and moved on with a glowing heart. I am somewhere in between. I have a job that pays the bills, a tiny apartment that I am slowly filling with things that actually feel like mine, and grandparents who show up for me in ways I didn't know adults could show up for a kid. I still have days where I walk past a hardware aisle and think of my father in the garage, pretending everything was fine. I still have nights where I wake up from a dream about my mother and feel 16 kinds of angry that she is not here to see who I turned out to be. Sometimes I wonder what the twins know about me, what story they have been told. Am I the selfish daughter who abandoned her father, or the ghost of a sister they barely remember meeting? I don't know. The difference now is that I don't feel responsible for fixing whatever story they were fed. People love to say that time heals all wounds. I don't buy that. Time gives you space to decide what to do with the wound. You can keep picking at it. You can cover it up and pretend it's not there, or you can clean it out and let it scar. My father picked the cover-up route until it swallowed him. My stepmother used the wound as a weapon. I am trying to let mine scar in a way that still lets me move. If you are waiting for some big moral here, I don't really have one. I am not going to tell you to forgive everyone or to cut everyone off. I am just going to say this. You are allowed to decide who gets to be in your life, even if they share your blood. You are allowed to walk away from people who call your pain drama and your boundaries attitude. You are allowed to choose the grandparents who came for you over the father who signed the papers to let you go. There are still moments that catch me off guard, little ambushes from the past that show up in regular days. Like when I am standing in the hallway at work and hear a father raise his voice at his kid in the waiting room, and my whole body tenses before my brain has time to remind me that I am not the one he is talking to. Or when I see a family at a restaurant, parents talking over their kids like they're background noise, and I feel this weird mix of judgment and sadness because I know exactly how it feels to be the piece of the picture nobody really wants to acknowledge. I am not proud of every thought I have. Sometimes I am petty. Sometimes I compare, even though comparing pain is a useless sport. Sometimes I catch myself rehearsing arguments in my head that will never actually happen, coming up with the perfect lines too late on purpose because it is safer than having to say them to someone's face. I am working on not letting those moments define whole days. Some mornings I wake up and feel almost light, like my life is finally more mine than theirs. I make coffee in my chipped mug, feed the neighbor's cat when she travels, respond to group chats about boring adult things like rent and grocery. And for a while, my family is just something I once had, not something I am still climbing out of. Other mornings, I open my eyes and feel 12 again, standing in the hallway watching someone pack my mother's things into boxes. On those days, I let the younger version of me be as dramatic as she needs to be in my head. I let her cry and swear and slam imaginary doors. And then I remind her that she got out, that she is not stuck there anymore, that the people who tried to shrink her world do not get the final say. If there is anything close to a lesson in all of this, it is probably that love is not supposed to feel like walking on eggshells in your own house. It is not supposed to sound like you are too sensitive every time you say you are hurt. It is not supposed to ask you to disappear, so someone else can be more comfortable. I spent so many years thinking I was the problem, that if I could just be quieter, easier, less emotional, everything would settle down. Now I know that settled and silent are not the same thing. And peace that depends on one person swallowing everything is not peace at all. It is just fear with better lighting. I used to think family was something you were stuck with. Now I think it is something you build, piece by piece, with the people who actually show up. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is close a door and leave it closed. Even if the person on the other side finally realizes they never should have let you walk through it in the first place. I am still figuring it out one uneven, imperfect day at a time. Have you ever faced a moment where you realized you had to choose yourself over family? I really want to hear your stories and your thoughts on this. Let me know in the comments below.